Feminist journalist Evelyn Hart came to the gala, ready to take down Clint Eastwood, the symbol of everything she thought was wrong with Hollywood. But when the legendary actor turned the tables, she found herself in a battle she never expected. What he said left her, and everyone watching, speechless. At one end of the ballroom stood Evelyn Hart, a rising star in the world of progressive journalism. With her sharp wit, unapologetic opinions, and a reputation for dismantling outdated ideologies, Evelyn had become a voice for a new generation. She wasn't here to sip champagne or rub elbows with the Hollywood elite. She was here for one reason: to confront Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, Eastwood was a living legend, a man whose name was synonymous with old-school masculinity and unapologetic grit. To Evelyn, he represented everything she had spent her career fighting against, an icon of a bygone era that refused to fade quietly into history. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, crafting the perfect questions to challenge him, to expose him as a relic of a world that no longer had a place in modern society. But as she watched him from across the room, standing alone at the bar with a quiet confidence that seemed to draw the attention of everyone around him, Evelyn felt a flicker of doubt. He didn't look like a man who could be easily rattled. He looked like a man who had seen it all and survived. Still, Evelyn wasn't about to back down. She adjusted her blazer, checked her recording app one last time, and started toward him. This was her moment. She was ready to make a statement, to create a viral moment that would cement her place as a fearless journalist, unafraid to challenge the old guard. What she didn't realize was that Clint Eastwood wasn't just a man of the past. He was a man who had spent a lifetime facing down challenges far greater than a young reporter with a microphone. And tonight, Evelyn was about to learn that some battles don't go the way you plan. What happens when a fearless journalist meets an unshakable legend? Evelyn Hart is about to find out that the truth she's chasing may not be the one she's ready to hear. Stay tuned as the sparks fly in a confrontation that will leave both of them, and everyone watching, forever changed. Evelyn's heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she approached the bar, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head, imagining every possible response Clint Eastwood might give her. She had prepared for anger, for defensiveness, even for dismissal. What she hadn't prepared for was the calm, almost indifferent way he turned to look at her as she stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice steady but loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "Evelyn Hart," the progressive voice, "do you mind if I ask you a few questions about your career and your views on Hollywood's changing landscape?" Eastwood's eyes met hers, sharp and unflinching. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his gaze was enough to make Evelyn's confidence falter for a split second. He took a slow sip of his drink, then set the glass down on the bar with deliberate precision. "Go ahead," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, regaining her composure. "You've been in the industry for over 6 decades, and your work has been celebrated by many. But there are those who feel that your films and the values they represent are out of touch with modern audiences. Do you think there's still a place for men like you in today's Hollywood?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few heads turned, and the murmur of conversation around them quieted. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the room on her, waiting to see how this would play out. Eastwood didn't react immediately. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a faint smirk, he leaned back against the bar. "Men like me?" he repeated, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Evelyn hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She had expected him to deflect or dismiss her, not to turn the spotlight back on her. But she recovered quickly, her voice firm as she replied, "I mean men who cling to outdated ideas about masculinity and power. Men who refuse to adapt to the progress being made in society. Progress that's giving women and marginalized voices the platform they've been denied for so long." Eastwood raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening slightly. "Outdated ideas, huh? And you're the one who gets to decide what's outdated?" Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood held up a hand, stopping her. "Let me tell you something, Ms. Hart. I've been in this business long enough to see trends come and go. People like to talk about progress, but half the time they don't even know what they're progressing toward. They just want to tear down what came before, thinking that'll make them important." His words were calm, measured, but they carried a weight that made Evelyn's stomach tighten. Oh, she could feel the room shifting, the audience leaning in, captivated by the exchange. This wasn't going the way she had planned. But Evelyn wasn't ready to back down. She had come here to make a point, and she wasn't about to let Clint Eastwood turn the tables on her. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice rising slightly, "it's easy for someone in your position to dismiss progress when you've benefited from a system that's been designed to elevate men like you while silencing others." The room went silent. Evelyn could feel the tension thickening, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She had thrown down the gauntlet, and now it was up to Eastwood to respond. He didn't react immediately. Instead, he picked up his drink, took another slow sip, and set it down again. Then he looked at her, his eyes steady and unyielding. "You think I had it easy?" he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You think the world just handed me everything because I'm a man? Let me tell you something, Ms. Hart. I've worked harder, failed more, and fought longer than you can imagine. And I didn't get here by tearing other people down. I got here by building something that mattered." Evelyn thought she was ready for this confrontation. But Clint Eastwood isn't just a relic of the past. He's a man who's lived through struggles she can't begin to imagine. As the tension rises, Evelyn is forced to confront the possibility that her assumptions about him and about herself might not hold up under scrutiny. What happens when the fight you've prepared for turns into a lesson you didn't expect? Stay tuned. Evelyn's jaw tightened as Clint's words settled over the room. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet authority in his tone that made her feel like a student being lectured by a teacher. But she wasn't about to let him take control of the narrative. She had come here to challenge him, and she wasn't going to back down now. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice steady but laced with defiance, "your struggles don't erase the fact that Hollywood has historically been a place where women and marginalized voices have been silenced. You may have worked hard, but you worked in a system that was built to favor men like you. That's the reality." Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you think you're doing right now, Ms. Hart? Speaking your mind, challenging me in front of a room full of people, making your point loud and clear. Doesn't seem like you're being silenced to me." A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the crowd, and Evelyn felt her cheeks flush. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, some amused, some curious, others waiting to see how she would respond. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "This isn't about me," she said firmly. "It's about the countless voices that never got the chance to speak up. It's about the women who were told to stay quiet, the people of color who were pushed to the sidelines, the—" Clint cut her off with a raised hand. "I know what it's about," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm not saying those voices don't matter. They do. But you don't make progress by tearing down everything that came before you. You make progress by building something better. And that takes more than just words, Miss Hart. It takes action. It takes time. It takes understanding." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her feel like he could see right through her. "You think you're the first person to come at me like this?" he said. "You think you're the first person to try to paint me as the villain? I've been in this business for over 60 years, Miss Hart. I've seen it all. And let me tell you something. Real change doesn't come from people who just want to make a scene. It comes from people who are willing to do the work, even when it's hard, even when it's not glamorous, even when no one's watching." The room was silent. Evelyn could feel the tension in the air, the weight of Clint's words pressing down on her. She wanted to argue, to push back, to prove him wrong. But for the first time she found herself at a loss for words. Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute. "So tell me, Miss Hart," he said, "what are you building?" Evelyn froze. The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She had spent so much time tearing down the systems she believed were broken, so much time calling out the people she thought were part of the problem. But what had she built? What had she created that would last? She didn't have an answer, and Clint knew it. Evelyn's silence stretched for a moment too long, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. The room seemed to shrink, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the background as Clint's question echoed in her mind. "What are you building?" She opened her mouth, desperate to regain control of the conversation, but the words wouldn't come. Her carefully rehearsed arguments, her arsenal of talking points, they all felt hollow now, like weapons that had lost their edge. Clint didn't press her. He simply watched her, his expression calm but unyielding, as if he had all the time in the world. It wasn't arrogance, it was patience, the kind that came from a lifetime of weathering storms far greater than this one. Finally, Evelyn forced herself to speak. "I'm building awareness," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I'm shining a light on the issues that people like you would rather ignore. That's how change starts, with awareness." Clint raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Awareness," he repeated, as if testing the word. "And what happens after that? What happens when the spotlight moves on to the next issue, the next outrage? What's left behind?" Evelyn bristled. "It's not just about me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's about holding people accountable. It's about making sure the old ways of thinking don't keep holding us back." Clint nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "Accountability's important," he said. "But it's not the same as progress. You can tear down a building, but if you don't know how to build something better in its place, all you're left with is rubble." The room was silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, some sympathetic, others skeptical. She had walked into this confrontation expecting to expose Clint Eastwood as a relic of the past, a man clinging to outdated ideas. But now she was the one on the defensive, her arguments unraveling under the weight of his quiet conviction. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "So what would you suggest, Mr. Eastwood?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "That we just accept the way things are? That we stop pushing for change because it's hard?" Clint shook his head. "Not at all," he said. "But change doesn't come from shouting the loudest or tearing people down. It comes from understanding where we've been, what worked and what didn't. It comes from building something better, not just for yourself, but for everyone." Evelyn felt a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor of her certainty. She had spent so much of her career fighting against the systems she believed were broken, so much time calling out the people she thought were part of the problem. But what had she built? What had she created that would last? Before she could respond, Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've got passion, Miss Hart," he said. "I'll give you that. But passion without purpose? That's just noise." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment she couldn't think of a single thing to say. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn had come to this gala to expose Clint Eastwood, to prove that he was a relic of a world that no longer mattered. But now, standing in front of him, she felt the ground beneath her shift. What if she wasn't as certain as she thought? What if the truth she had been chasing wasn't as simple as she believed? And what if, in trying to tear him down, she was the one who needed to be rebuilt? Evelyn's mind raced as Clint's words lingered in the air. Passion without purpose? The phrase gnawed at her, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She had spent years building her career on passion, on calling out injustice, on amplifying voices that had been silenced. But now, for the first time, she wondered if that passion had been enough. Had she been so focused on tearing down the old that she had forgotten to build something new? The silence between them stretched, and Evelyn could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. She glanced around, catching the curious stares of the crowd. Some looked amused, others skeptical, but a few, just a few, seemed to be waiting, as if they wanted to see what she would do next. She straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet Clint's gaze. "I'm not here to tear anyone down," she said, her voice steady but quieter now. "I'm here to challenge the systems that have held people back for too long. I'm here to make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles." Clint nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a noble goal," he said. "But let me ask you this. How do you plan to do that? By pointing fingers? By shouting louder than everyone else? Or by actually doing the work?" Evelyn bristled at his tone, but she couldn't deny the truth in his words. She had spent so much time calling out the flaws in others, but what had she done to fix them? What had she built that would stand the test of time? "I'm doing the work," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I'm raising awareness. I'm starting conversations." Clint tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Conversations are a good start," he said. "But they're just that, a start. Real change takes more than words, Ms. Hart. It takes action. It takes sacrifice. And it takes a hell of a lot more than tearing down the people who came before you." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone that carried the weight of decades of experience. "You think you're fighting for progress, but all you're doing is fighting. Progress isn't about winning or losing. It's about building something better. And that's a lot harder than standing in front of a crowd and pointing fingers." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment she couldn't think of a single thing to say. She had come here to challenge Clint Eastwood, to expose him as a relic of the past. But now, standing in front of him, she felt exposed instead. He wasn't just challenging her arguments. He was challenging her entire approach, her entire way of thinking. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Evelyn is right to challenge Clint, or does Clint have a point about building instead of tearing down? We'd love to hear your perspective. And while you're here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories that challenge the way we think and inspire meaningful conversations. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, waiting to see how she would respond. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'm not saying it's easy," she said finally, her voice quieter now. But someone has to hold people accountable. Someone has to push for change. Clint nodded, his expression softening slightly. You're right, he said. But accountability isn't the same as progress. And if you spend all your time tearing people down, you'll never have the chance to build something better. Evelyn felt a flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor of her certainty. She had spent so much of her career fighting against the systems she believed were broken, so much time calling out the people she thought were part of the problem. But what had she built? What had she created that would last? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the room seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn could feel the weight of Clint's words pressing down on her, forcing her to confront a truth she hadn't been ready to face. For the first time in her career, Evelyn Hart wasn't sure if she was the one asking the right questions or if she was the one who needed to answer them. Evelyn stood frozen, Clint's words echoing in her mind. If you spend all your time tearing people down, you'll never have the chance to build something better. She had come here to challenge him, to expose him as a symbol of everything wrong with the old guard. But now, she felt like she was the one under the spotlight, her motives and methods laid bare for everyone to see. The crowd around them had grown, their quiet murmurs filling the air as they watched the exchange unfold. Evelyn could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her next move. She had always thrived in moments like this, feeding off the energy of an audience. But now it felt different. The weight of their attention was suffocating, and for the first time, she wasn't sure what to say. Clint leaned back against the bar, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. He wasn't gloating or trying to humiliate her. He didn't need to. His calm, measured demeanor was enough to make her feel like she was standing on shaky ground. "You've got a lot of fire, Ms. Hart," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "And that's not a bad thing. But fire can do two things. It can destroy, or it can forge something stronger. The choice is yours." Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to argue, to push back, to prove him wrong. But deep down, she knew there was truth in his words. She had spent so much of her career focused on exposing the flaws in others. But what had she done to create something better? What had she built that would stand the test of time? She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the faces of the people watching her. Some looked amused, others skeptical. But a few, just a few, seemed to be waiting, as if they wanted to see what she would do next. For the first time, she felt the weight of their expectations, the pressure to not just speak, but to act. "I'm not here to destroy anything," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I'm here to make things better." Clint nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then start by listening," he said. "You might be surprised what you learn." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment she couldn't think of a single thing to say. She had come here to challenge Clint Eastwood, to expose him as a relic of the past. But now, standing in front of him, she felt exposed instead. He wasn't just challenging her arguments, he was challenging her entire approach, her entire way of thinking. The silence between them stretched, and Evelyn could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I'll listen," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet. "But only if you're willing to do the same." Clint's lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Fair enough," he said. "But be careful, Miss Hart. Listening might just change the way you see things." Evelyn had come to this gala to expose Clint Eastwood, to prove that he was a relic of a world that no longer mattered. But now, standing in front of him, she felt the ground beneath her shift. What if she wasn't as certain as she thought? What if the truth she had been chasing wasn't as simple as she believed? And what if, in trying to tear him down, she was the one who needed to be rebuilt. The crowd began to disperse, sensing that the confrontation had reached a quieter, more introspective phase. The tension in the room eased, but Evelyn could still feel the weight of Clint's words pressing on her. She had expected a battle of wits, a clash of ideologies, but what she had gotten instead was something far more disarming, a challenge to look inward. Clint gestured to the empty bar stool beside him. "Why don't you sit down, Ms. Hart? You've got questions and I've got time." Evelyn hesitated. Sitting down felt like a concession, like admitting she wasn't as in control of the situation as she wanted to be. But there was something in Clint's tone, calm, steady, and without malice, that made her curious. Against her better judgment, she slid onto the stool, her recorder still running in her pocket. "All right," she said, folding her hands on the bar. "Let's talk." Clint nodded, signaling the bartender for another drink. "You've got fire," he said again, his voice low and gravelly. "That's good. The world needs people who care enough to fight for something. But tell me, Miss Hart, what are you really fighting for?" Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I'm fighting for progress," she said, her voice firm. "For equality. For a world where people aren't held back by outdated ideas and systems." Clint took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "And you think the way to get there is by tearing people like me down?" "It's not personal," Evelyn said quickly. "It's about what you represent. The old guard. The systems that have kept people like me, like women, like marginalized voices, on the sidelines for too long." Clint nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I get it," he said. "You see me as a symbol of everything that's wrong with the world. But let me tell you something, Ms. Hart. Symbols are easy to attack. People, they're a lot more complicated." Evelyn frowned, unsure of where he was going with this. "What do you mean?" "I mean you don't know me," Clint said simply. "You've read about me, sure. You've seen my movies, maybe even dug up some old interviews. But you don't know what I've been through, what I've fought for, what I've lost. You see a man who doesn't fit your idea of progress, and you think that's all there is to me." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but Clint held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not saying I'm perfect," he said. "Hell, I've made more mistakes than I can count. But progress isn't about erasing the past, Ms. Hart. It's about learning from it. And you can't learn from something if you're too busy trying to tear it down." The words hit her harder than she expected, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. She had spent so much of her career focused on exposing the flaws in others. But what had she done to understand them? What had she done to build something better? "I'm not trying to erase the past," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I just want to make sure we don't repeat it." Clint nodded, his expression softening slightly. "That's a good goal," he said. "But you've got to remember, progress isn't just about moving forward. It's about knowing where you've been, what worked, and what didn't. It's about building something better, not just tearing down what came before." Evelyn looked down at her hands, her mind racing. She had come here to challenge Clint Eastwood, to expose him as a relic of the past. But now she was starting to wonder if she had been too quick to judge, too eager to paint him as the villain in her story. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I've been so focused on fighting that I forgot what I was fighting for." Clint smiled faintly, raising his glass in a small toast. "That's a good start, Ms. Hart. The first step to building something better is figuring out what you want to build." As Evelyn sat there, the weight of her own words sinking in, she realized that this conversation wasn't just about Clint Eastwood. It was about her, about the choices she had made, the battles she had fought, and the person she wanted to become. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she had all the answers. But maybe, Just maybe. That was the point. Evelyn sat in silence for a moment, Clint's words echoing in her mind. The first step to building something better is figuring out what you want to build. She had spent so much of her career focused on what she was against, systems, ideologies, people, but she had never stopped to think about what she was truly for. What kind of world did she want to create? What kind of legacy did she want to leave behind? Clint broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. You know, Ms. Hart, people like to talk about progress like it's a straight line, like you can just bulldoze through the past and build something new on top of it. But it doesn't work that way. The past is messy. People are messy. And if you don't take the time to understand that, you're just going to end up making the same mistakes in a different way. Evelyn frowned, her mind racing. So what are you saying? That we should just accept the way things are? That we shouldn't push for change? Clint shook his head. Not at all. Change is necessary. But it's not about tearing everything down and starting over. It's about taking the time to understand what's worth keeping, what needs to be fixed, and what needs to be left behind. It's about building something that lasts. Evelyn leaned forward, her curiosity getting the better of her. And what do you think is worth keeping? Clint smiled faintly, his eyes distant, as if he were looking back on a lifetime of memories. The stories, he said simply. The stories that remind us who we are, where we've been, and what we're capable of. The stories that teach us about courage, resilience, and hope. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that last. Evelyn tilted her head, intrigued. But what if those stories are flawed? What if they're built on outdated ideas or harmful stereotypes? Clint nodded, his expression thoughtful. Then you tell new stories. You take what's good, what's true, and you build on it. You don't erase the past. You learn from it. You honor the lessons, even if they're hard ones. That's how you move forward. Evelyn sat back, her mind spinning. She had never thought about it that way before. She had always seen the past as something to overcome, something to leave behind. But maybe Clint was right. Maybe the past wasn't just a burden, it was a foundation. And if she wanted to build something better, she needed to understand it first. So what's your story, Mr. Eastwood? She asked, her voice softer now. What do you want people to remember about you? Clint chuckled, a low, gravelly sound that carried a hint of self-deprecation. I don't care if they remember me, he said. I care if they remember the work. The stories I've told, the people I've worked with, the lessons I've learned. That's what matters, not me. Evelyn felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Admiration, maybe, or respect. She had come here to expose Clint Eastwood, to prove that he was a relic of a world that no longer mattered. But now, she was starting to see him in a different light. He wasn't just a symbol of the past. He was a man who had lived through it, who had learned from it, who had something to teach her if she was willing to listen. As the conversation continued, Evelyn began to realize that this wasn't just about Clint Eastwood. It was about her. About the story she wanted to tell, the legacy she wanted to leave, and the kind of person she wanted to be. For the first time, she wasn't just fighting against something. She was starting to think about what she wanted to build. And that, she realized, was the beginning of something new. The conversation between Evelyn and Clint stretched on, the crowd around them thinning as the night wore on. What had started as a confrontation had turned into something entirely different, a dialogue, a meeting of two minds from different worlds. Evelyn found herself asking questions she hadn't planned, not to trap Clint, but to understand him. And Clint, for his part, answered with a candor that surprised her. He told her about his early days in Hollywood, the struggles, the failures, the moments of doubt. He spoke about the lessons he had learned, the mistakes he had made, and the people who had shaped him along the way. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and he didn't try to paint himself as a hero. He was just a man who had lived a long life, who had seen the world change and had changed with it in his own way. Evelyn listened, really listened, for the first time in a long time. She realized that Clint wasn't the caricature she had built in her mind. He wasn't just a symbol of the past. He was a person, flawed and complex, but also wise in ways she hadn't expected. And as she listened, she began to see herself more clearly, too. When the conversation finally came to an end, Clint stood, his movements slow but steady. He looked down at Evelyn, his expression calm but kind. "You've got a lot of potential, Ms. Hart," he said. "But don't waste it on tearing people down. Use it to build something that matters." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint gave her a small smile, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Evelyn watched him go, her mind racing. She had come to this gala to expose Clint Eastwood, to prove that he was a relic of the past. But instead, she had been the one exposed. And in the process, she had learned something she hadn't expected. 3 days later, Evelyn sat at her desk, staring at her laptop screen. The article she had planned to write about Clint Eastwood remained unfinished, the cursor blinking on a blank page. She had tried to write it the way she always did, sharp, critical, uncompromising. But the words wouldn't come. They felt wrong, dishonest. She thought about Clint's question, "What are you building?" And for the first time, she realized she didn't have an answer. She had spent so much time fighting against things, but she had never stopped to think about what she was fighting for. She had been so focused on tearing down the old that she had forgotten to think about what she wanted to create in its place. With a deep breath, she started typing. This time, she didn't try to spin the story or manipulate the narrative. She just wrote the truth about the conversation she had with Clint, about the lessons she had learned, about the way it had forced her to confront her own assumptions and biases. She wrote about the importance of listening, of understanding, of building something better instead of just tearing things down. When she finished, she read it over. It wasn't the article she had planned to write, and it wasn't the article her editor would want, but it was honest, it was real, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt like she was building something that mattered. She hit send. The response was immediate and polarizing. Some of her readers praised her for her honesty, for her willingness to reflect and grow. Others accused her of selling out, of betraying her principles. But Evelyn didn't care. For the first time, she wasn't writing for clicks or validation. She was writing for herself. A week later, she received an email from Clint Eastwood. It was short and to the point. "Good article. Keep building." Evelyn smiled as she read it, a sense of peace settling over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was on the right path. She wasn't just fighting anymore. She was building. And that, she realized, was the real meaning of progress. Evelyn Hart had come to the gala to challenge a legend, to expose him as a relic of the past. But in the end, it was Clint Eastwood who had challenged her, forcing her to confront her own assumptions and rethink her approach. She had walked into that room with a mission to tear him down, but she had walked out with something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, in growth, and in the power of building something that lasts. Was Clint right, or do you think Evelyn's approach had merit? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories and discussions. Let's keep the conversation going and build something meaningful together.